Hello, my name is Jonathan Holloway, and I'd like to speak about web service level agreements, which are service level agreements that focus more on web services. Uh, a service level agreement in the IT perspective is an electronic contract between two companies, one being a network service provider and the other being a customer. Um, what the service level agreement defines is what service is going to be available, how much of it is going to be available, and when is it going to be available. And these are measured within the contract with something called metrics, which I'm going to get into later. Service level agreements are increasingly important today because a lot of different companies are offering different services that they didn't offer in the past. It is used by many different parties, many different corporations, including IT departments in enterprise environments. Service level agreements in that scenario would actually use a benchmark performance to compare themselves against to see if their performance would be lacking or if they are uh, performing above that benchmark. But in that scenario, the service level agreement will be between that particular IT department and the customers that they service. Customers being in the organization that they work for. I spoke earlier about common metrics used in service level agreements. Metrics would be what they measure in a service level agreement to determine if the service is being offered at the rate that it was promised. Different types of metrics that are used would be the percentage of time the service would be available to the customers. It would also be how many customers can be supported at one time. And like I said earlier, a benchmark to compare actual service to, and a certain service response time that can be promised. Um, there were initially problems with the traditional service level agreement that would not translate well over with web service level agreements. The first problem would be there was a vague definition of terms because of the many different types of organizations that use service level agreements. The terms used in the service level objectives, such as things like availability, throughput, downtime, bandwidth, and response time, can mean a lot of different things to different companies. So there wasn't very uniform language there. There's also a financial strain on companies. Service level agreements are plain natural language documents. Just think of a legal contract. And because they need to be provisioned and monitored constantly, it placed financial strain on the business to have them. So overall, the huge problem with the traditional service level agreements was that um, there need to be more uniformity, and there was a great need for an automated process. In today's IT environment, the definition, negotiation, deployment, monitoring, and enforcement of service level agreements had to become an automated process. So possible solutions were thought up to this. First one being a general service level agreement template. Um, that template would include several automatically processed fields and an otherwise natural language written service level agreement. However, this approach lacked flexibility and would only be suitable with companies where the same type of service is being offered using the same quality of service parameters, and they offer the service that's not likely to undergo huge changes over time. So as you can see, that might limit a lot of companies that would actually want to use this template. Especially, it could be an issue with internet service providers that need to supply different types of network services, especially these days, to their customers, and it will require different types of service level agreement requirements. They would need definitely a more flexible, formal language to express service and service level agreements, and a runtime architecture comprising a set of services being able to interpret this language. So here's issues with templates. I spoke about this. A solution was thought up, and IBM back in 2002 came up with the idea of having a service level agreement based on specifically web services. So we came up with web based SLAs. So web based service level agreement, or WSLAs, was targeted at defining and monitoring service level agreements for web services. Like I said, it was the framework concept was created by IBM in 2002. Uh, it definitely concentrates on web services, but the framework can be used in any situations where a service level agreement is necessary. Um, Web-based service level agreements measure and monitor the quality of service parameters. They check the agreed upon service levels and report violations to authorized parties involved in the service level management process. Um, the framework that IBM came up with is based on a language called XML, which is definitely similar to it's similar to HTML, but it is a bit different. Flexibility of web service level agreements allow monitoring on both sides, as well as a unique ability to have a third party handle everything. And I'll speak more about that later. So let's get into the more technical aspects of WSLAs. The first thing is that it complements WSDL. If you don't know what WSDL is, WSDL stands for Web Service Definition Language, which is a machine language that lets the computer know what web services are operating on this port. And it's important to know that WSLAs don't conflict with that. As you can see in this picture, uh, it has nothing to do with a WSDL. WSDL defines what's happening on the port. WSLA references that in order to receive measurements to 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 define whether or not the service level agreement is met or is not met. So let's take a look at the WSLA lifecycle. Um, Here's a nice little picture here. Starting with number one, only the service provider and the service customer can negotiate and sign a service level agreement. Once it's put into establishment and an SLA actually exists between the two, it's important to see here that it only references the WSDL. It doesn't serve to replace it. Once the SLA is put into deployment, measurements are taken according to specific guidelines in the service level agreement contract. If a condition exists where it's not meeting that service level agreement, it is sent over to management or another business entity, and it is sent up to be dealt with. It can either have uh, different consequences. They would either open up a trouble ticket or a problem report. A penalty payment or a premium payment might need to be paid, or the contract could be terminated. But it can only be terminated through the service customer and the service provider. Let's talk about the WSLA's ability to utilize third parties. WSLA agreements allow signatory parties to delegate responsibilities to third parties. They come into play when either a function needs to be carried out that neither service provider nor customer wants to do, or if one of the signatory parties doesn't trust the other one to perform the function correctly. These third parties are called supporting parties, and they are defined in a WSLA along with the signatory parties. Um, Supporting parties may act in one or all of three different roles. Uh, they can act as a measurement service, a condition evaluation service, or a management service. If it acts as a measurement service, it would implement a part or all of the measurement functionality required by one or both signatory parties. If it acts as a condition evaluation service, it would implement the functionality to compare actual values against the agreed upon thresholds for all or part of the obligations defined in an SLA, meaning that it would compare against the benchmark. If it acts as a management service, it will implement functionality to carry out the management actions of a signatory party once an obligation has been violated, meaning that the third party will be empowered to impose fines or maybe even have the ability to terminate the contract if necessary. And here's a nice little picture here that would illustrate the relationship between a third party and two signatory parties. And here's a sample web service level agreement between two parties. This is basically how it's structured. The first part would have the involved parties, which would be the ID, maybe IP address of the signatory parties. They would define any supporting parties underneath, and then it would go on to describe the service. So there would be a rather detailed description of what service is being offered, what operations are offered by the services, any bindings, are there any encryption, encoding, transport for messages that need to be defined. And next would be what are the agreed upon SLA parameters? What is the output? Parameters include service availability, service throughput, or service response time. That would all be defined there. Metrics used as input. How would they be measured? Metrics in this case are split into two different types: composite and resource metrics. Resource composite is as it sounds. It mixes different resource components to come up with a composite metric. Resource metrics might be system uptime, system outage periods, or number of service invocations, while the composite metrics would be the maximum response time of a service, the average availability of a service, or minimum throughput of a service. Measurement directives. How do you read, how you input or access metrics that will be spelled out in the service level agreement. And like I said earlier, both parties in the service level agreement, as well as a supporting party, any supporting party that is spelled out, would have access to this information. Next, what algorithm is used to measure these metrics, and what schedule? How often will these metrics be measured? The final section will be obligations. Any guarantees or constraints that are laid out in the WSLA process. For example, what is the validity period? When is the SLA parameter guaranteed, or how long is it guaranteed? Next is the predicate. How do you detect violations? What is the formula for detecting violations? That's spelled out. And finally, any actions that are spelled out in the contract in case the service level agreement is violated, or one party is not exactly living up to their part of the bargain. This would actually spell out what corrective actions will be carried out. So, in conclusion, IBM saw the increasing trend in companies offering web services of various types, and they saw that the previous service level agreement structure would not be flexible enough to accommodate them, while they still promoted growth of services. Web service level agreements offer flexible definitions of measurement metrics, offer monitoring by all parties, even third-party vendors, and seamless integration over web services. Administrators looking to implement WSLAs on their own systems can download it as part of the IBM Emerging Technologies Toolkit on their website, and further information on WSLAs can be found in the references section of my slideshow. Thanks for listening.